So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this conversation. I'm really pleased that you're here for today's launch event of the Virtual Biodiversity Forum 2021. The event series that we're having this year, on the one hand, it bridges the time until we can get together at the second World Biodiversity Forum in Davos in 2022. I'm very pleased that we have today Dr. Larigauderie, the Executive Secretary of IPBES, and David Cooper, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, with us today, telling us about the work that's happening within the convention. And then in the panel, I'd like to welcome Chadia Vanos, who is the coordinator of the Towards a Safer World Network. She works on pandemic preparedness and risk assessment of health emergency, and I can imagine she's very busy at this time at the moment. Then I'd like to welcome Rashid Sumaya, the director of the Fisheries Economics Research Unit at the University of British Columbia. He's specializing on the economics of fisheries and marine ecosystem valuation. I'd like to welcome Lynn Shannon from the Marine Research Institute at the University of Cape Town. She's focusing on ecosystem management and fisheries. And last but not least, Mark Rounswell, who's Professor of Land Use Change at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and he's working on the human dimension of land use change. And without further ado, again, welcome everybody. And I'll now like to ask David Cooper to give a short introductory lecture. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Cornelia, and thank you for organizing this, and to you and the whole team at the World Biodiversity Forum and Tealeaves for bringing us together at the start of this year. As you mentioned, I will give an introduction based upon the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which was published in September last year. And I will focus on the forward-looking part of that outlook. So happy New Year to everyone. Although I have to say 2021 still seems very much like 2020 so far, unfortunately. And I think, as most of you probably realize, 2020 was to be the year in which, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, I work for the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, we were to have held a Conference of the Parties in Kunming, China, to assess where we are in biodiversity, in particular with regard to the current strategic plan and the Aichi biodiversity targets, and then to adopt a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework, a framework for action across all sectors, across all institutions, to shape actions to address biodiversity loss in the future, towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. This vision was agreed already by governments in Nagoya 10 years ago. We already knew as we entered 2020 that the global biodiversity framework would need to facilitate really transformative changes. We knew this from the IPBES global assessment, and Anne will tell us more about that assessment in a few minutes. But that given the current declines in biodiversity loss, major changes across society, across the economy would be needed to address biodiversity loss and to put us on a path to recovery towards that 2050 vision. Of course, then in 2020, the emergence of COVID-19, the pandemic, has really thrown into sharp relief the current dysfunctional relationship between people and nature. I think it's helped, in a sense, many people realize that addressing biodiversity loss is important not only in its own sake, but for the future of humanity. It's really an existential question alongside and in fact very much linked to the issue of addressing climate change. So I'll just give a little bit of information on where we are in terms of global biodiversity, in terms of the information from the Biodiversity Outlook. 10 years ago, government set these 20 targets, the 20 Aichi targets, most of which have a deadline of the end of 2020. We know from the Global Biodiversity Outlook and building on, in fact, the IPBES report, that none of these targets were met, at least not in full. Some of them, indicated by the green segments in this slide before you, show that some elements of the targets were met, but none were fully met. At the same time, and I don't want to sugarcoat this because this was certainly not a great result, but at the same time, we do know that where actions have been taken, serious actions have been taken, for example, to reduce the rate of deforestation, for example, to improve the state of fisheries, for example, to prevent extinctions where we know the cause. Significant progress has been made. And this demonstrates that, in fact, if governments and actors are serious about policies, they do work. What do we need to do as we now enter this decade? What do we need to do to address biodiversity loss? We know from the science, and this very much again from the IPBES assessment, some also new work prefaced in that IPBES assessment but developed later, show, as indicated in this schematic figure before you, that biodiversity will continue to decline under business as usual scenarios. We know also that that decline would jeopardize achievement of most of our social and development goals, the sustainable development goals. We also know, though, and this is including work published in 2020, that measures can be taken to slow biodiversity loss and ultimately bend the curve, at least for some indicators of biodiversity, some parameters of biodiversity. In the next decade, at least, we know that the largest driver of biodiversity loss on land will be land use change. And therefore, addressing land use change, and in particular addressing the expansion of agriculture, will be vital. We will need very sharp investments in conservation, in ecosystem restoration. And that's indicated on the green segment here. But we know that this will only be possible. There will only be space, if you like, in the landscape, if at the same time we are investing in improving the productivity of agriculture and addressing consumption such that we at least minimize the increases in demand that will eventually come from land. These are the orange and red segments here. We also know that without addressing climate change, it's not possible to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. All bets would be off. We also need the stringent measures that are foreseen in the Paris Agreement, and we need these to be implemented. We also need to address the other drivers of biodiversity loss, most of which we have less information, but just looking briefly at the marine environment, and I'm sure Lynn and Rashid will pick up on this. We know, even though a third of fisheries currently at least are overfished, that it is possible with the right policies to bend that curve, to limit overfishing initially, to rebuild fisheries, and ultimately to actually increase both the sustainability and the productivity of fisheries. How do these things play out in the landscape and across sectors? Well, in GBO, again, very much building on the analysis of IPBES, we identified 8 areas, 8 sort of nexus areas, which you can see in this slide, where action will be needed. These build on 7 areas coming from the IPBES assessment, plus this area we've called the One Health transition, very much reflecting the situation we find ourselves in this year under the pandemic, and reflecting a lot of additional work that's been done in this area recently. We don't have time to go into all of these transitions now. Maybe some of this will come up in the panel discussion, but I want to mention 3 things that cut across them. Firstly, of course, through each of these transitions, we are trying to minimize and reduce the drivers of biodiversity loss on land, in freshwater, in the oceans, looking at the underlying drivers that are coming from food and agricultural systems and so on. Secondly, in most of these transitions, we're looking to see how biodiversity itself can be part of that solution, part of what needs to be done to enable a move towards sustainability and to actually contribute more directly to human well-being. For instance, under the sustainable agricultural transition, of investing in biodiversity in agricultural landscapes that allow us, for example, to lower the reliance on pesticides and rely more on natural pest control, to address pollinator deficits and increase production, to increase soil fertility while also reducing the overuse of fertilizers. And finally, each of these transitions really illustrates the need for a cross-sectoral approach for mainstreaming biodiversity in the relevant sectors. Perhaps this is most apparent in the One Health transition, where we see the need to manage landscapes, to manage the way we practice agriculture, to manage the way we use wildlife and the wildlife trade in a way that protects nature, protects human health and animal health and wider ecosystem health. And this requires a truly interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach. It applies much more cooperation across the sectors than we've seen to date. And finally, I just want to highlight the underlying drivers of change, the underlying economic, demographic drivers behind those values, worldviews, behaviors that drive the direct drivers. And look at the tools, the financial tools, the rights-based tools, behavioral tools, to how we can adjust social norms that can be used to change those indirect drivers. And the IPBES Global Assessment did a very good job of identifying in this respect these so-called levers and leverage points for transformative change. Just in drawing this to a close then, we have also learned, I think, in the last year that the COVID pandemic and the responses to it have shown that rapid and large-scale changes are possible. We're seeing now massive investment in stimulus and recovery packages. To date, the majority of those are not moving in the right direction. They are going to make it the job in Kunming in China when we come to adopt a new post-2020 framework more difficult. But there are signs, also some positive signs, that if we can build upon those, if we can shift the way countries are responding to the pandemic, sow seeds that will help these moves to the moves to transformative change that we need to see in the longer term. Under the Convention on Biological Diversity, in a few weeks' time, we'll be picking up the negotiations, initially with some informal meetings of the scientific subsidiary body, SBSTA, and the implementation body, and moving later in the year to further negotiations towards that post-2020 framework. Given the lack of time, I'll leave it there and hand back to Cornelia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this presentation. It actually was a wonderful introduction to this event today, and also to what we're planning, focusing on actually what we need to do to actually get to where we want to be. So thinking about how to reduce drivers, how can biodiversity be part of the solution? What are the tools needed? Who do we actually need to involve? And I think this is actually excellent. And with this, I think I'd like to hand over to Anne to tell us more about the findings from the global assessment and also the recent workshop on biodiversity and pandemics. Thanks very much, Anne. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. Happy New Year to everyone. And I will indeed, as an introduction to this virtual forum, present highlights from the global assessment and from the pandemic workshop of IPBES. And for that, you generously gave me 7 minutes. And so I will raise to the challenge, share my screen. Hopefully that is working. Share, we go. Like that. Good. Yes. So as everyone will have seen, IPBES has been over the first years of its existence, during its first work program, building a strong knowledge base for decision making on biodiversity with the production of 8 assessments, and that first work program culminated in the production of the IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, drawing on a vast body of literature as well as on the other IPBES assessments. So let me share 6 slides now for some highlights of that work. So overall, the main conclusion of the global assessment was that nature is deteriorating at a rate and scale unprecedented in human history, with, for example, 3/4 of the land surface of the planet being significantly altered, only 3% of the ocean surface still being considered as wild, and 1 million of plant and animal species out of an estimated 8 million being threatened with extinction. Second, the IPBES Global Assessment found that out of 18 contributions of nature to people, 15 have been declining over the past 50 years. That includes all of the regulating contributions, the capacity of ecosystems to regulate climate or to pollinate or to control air quality. That also includes a decline in all of the non-material contributions that you see at the bottom here, such as the physical and psychological experiences or the sense of identity that people derive from nature, as well as the very important capacity of ecosystems to maintain future options for people. The only contributions that have increased are some of the material contributions related to energy, food and feed, and thus obtained at the expense of all of the other ones. Third, and as mentioned by David just now, one of the other key conclusions was that with current negative trends, the Aichi targets will be missed in 2020. That has now also been the conclusion of the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, which was produced by the Convention on Biological Diversity, largely based, of course, on the global assessment and the other work of IPBES, but also complemented by an analysis of the 5th national reports of governments to the CBD. The report found only good progress in components of 4 of the 20 targets. And beyond that, it also concluded that with this current negative trends, many of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, would be missed by 2030, particularly those related to food, water, health, and climate. It is, of course, critical to address the causes of biodiversity loss. We're talking about direct and indirect causes. The global assessment ranked the direct causes by order of importance, starting on land, with the most important being land use, such as deforestation for agriculture in particular, or for construction. The second driver, and the main one for the ocean, is the overexploitation of resources. It's been mentioned just before that a third of our fisheries are overexploited. The third direct driver is climate change, which can drive local extinction, but also shifts in species distribution. The fourth is pollution in all of its forms, plastic, but also overuse of pesticides or fertilizers. And the fifth one is the invasive alien species. The indirect drivers have been mentioned by David, related to demography, to economy, consumption, institutions, governments, everything that people do, and that is related to their values and to the way they behave. All of that needs to be addressed if we want to have an impact on biodiversity loss itself. Now, the IPBES global assessment had concluded and already provided evidence that nature is the origin of most infectious diseases. That was an eternity ago, before the pandemic. This past July, IPBES convened a virtual workshop on biodiversity and pandemics, and a report was produced. It is not an assessment, it is a workshop report. It was not approved by government, and it's not a systematic review of the literature. It is, however, based on about 700 scientific references, many very recent. So that report concluded that the majority of emerging diseases and almost all known pandemics are caused by microbes found on animals. It really provided a strong ecological context for the emergence of pandemics. Sometimes that is something that is often neglected. And it also shows how these microbes spill over from infected animals into people under specific conditions that bring together humans with these infected animals, those conditions being human-driven. It also highlighted direct drivers of these emergencies. Land use change is one of the key drivers. It talked about deforestation for agriculture in particular, but also for livestock farming to produce meat, fragmentation. Those driven at a large scale cause pandemics through bringing people more in contact with nature. And wildlife trade is another important direct driver. It provides intimate contact between wildlife, livestock, and humans. There are, of course, underlying drivers to these emergencies. They have to do with consumption patterns, for example, for meat, but also for palm oil, which drive deforestation and sometimes emergence of pandemics, or also the consumption of fur, or the pet trade, or demand for medicine or fur, which drive wildlife trade. The report also talked about options for action. one of the key conclusions is that we are currently relying on responding to pandemics once they have emerged through technological innovations. We are waiting to be vaccinated. It is costly in terms of lives, economically speaking as well. The report makes a case that there might be a better approach that could focus as a complement to the response on prevention, based on more of an ecological approach, by better understanding the environment, the ecological context of the emergence of diseases, to try and prevent those through the One Health approach that David mentioned, which would consist in particular in building institutional bridges between various communities that have until now not worked together, in particular the conservation community, the forestry people, and people working on animal and human diseases, meaning the veterinarian as well as the medical community as well. And finally, and in conclusion, it's important to remind ourselves that it is not too late to act, but transformative change, the topic of the virtual forum, is definitely needed to achieve sustainability this year, 2021. We really need to be much more ambitious in conserving and restoring, in making cities more sustainable, in mitigating against climate change. We can do much better in exploiting our natural ecosystems to slow down global warming. We also need to improve the way we do agriculture. There is a lot to be gained from a transformation of agriculture and our food systems. I have included some of what could be done here: reduce harmful subsidies, reduce the loss of pesticides, improve agroecological practices, among many others. So I guess in conclusion, I think that we can wish ourselves a year which will really be a transformative year, a year where governments in particular, but everyone really embraces the potential of biodiversity, and finally takes the ambitious actions that biodiversity really needs. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anne, for giving us this overview. It's really appreciated. And the last slide that you showed us is actually a perfect introduction or start of the panel discussion. And I would actually just maybe, Chadia, start with you and ask you where we actually see where you see key transmission points, opportunities for transformation, especially now thinking about that we are stuck in a pandemic and we really need to rethink our relationship with nature.
Hi, sorry, I was trying to unmute. Thank you very much. Just to start by thanking David and Anne for the great setting of the discussions and providing the short summary of two great reports that were published in 2020, the Outlook on Biodiversity, and also the workshop that IPBES helped us to organize and produce the report on the linkage between biodiversity and pandemics in light of COVID-19 pandemic that we are in. So you ask about transitional point, or where can we see transformation can be done. I will start from the COVID-19 pandemic, and since now we have several vaccines on the markets, and the vaccination campaign started in many countries, and we have also some therapeutic treatment for the disease. We are thinking of the recovery after the COVID-19. So in this recovery, we have to make it a green one and sustainable recovery, so that it will act as insurance against future outbreaks or pandemics like COVID-19. We have been for 1 year now paralyzed. Our society is shut, our economy is shut because of the outbreaks. So what we can do is use this opportunity and have a green and sustainable and just and fair recovery after the pandemic. So we will not face this situation again with the future pandemic, and work, as Anne said and David, on prevention, not on the reactive approach that we have seen so far till now. Because the scientific evidence tell us that pandemics and outbreaks will occur more often, will spread more rapidly than we've seen in the last centuries, and they will have huge impact, not just on the life lost, which is in millions in this pandemics, but also on the livelihood, on the economy, and on the society in general. So this is my first transition point that I would like to share. The second one, it's about the wildlife trade and consumptions. It's mentioned that it's one of the risk drivers of pandemics emergence. And because most of the pandemics, or almost all of them, they are zoonotic. They are coming from the animal origin. So what we can do here is to focus on the regulating the legal trade and consumption of wildlife. Institutions institutionalize the surveillance mechanisms for diseases in the wildlife, and enhance biosecurity and biosafety measures in the markets that do this. Also, if we can work on the way we are farming or trading or consumption of wildlife and wildlife derived products like the fur, like the using them as food or as for medicines, because the way we are doing it now, it leads to biodiversity loss, and it leads to more emerging diseases because of this, including SARS that we have in 2004, and now the COVID-19 pandemic. The last point I would like to say about the transformation, as we are doing this green recovery, we have to think of the gender perspective of this work. Because women and men are affected differently of the pandemics and all disasters or extreme events because of the different exposure and to the hazards. But also we have to see women as an agent of change. So we have to involve them in the recovery part, including in finding environmental suitable solutions like setting up clean energy projects and in fighting ecosystem destructions and in adapting the agriculture practice that they do in the farms, usually small scale farms, but this will contribute to reducing climate change and biodiversity loss. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chadia. And maybe I can actually ask Mark to pick up on that, thinking about land use change. Exactly. How can we go about it?
Thanks, Cornelia. Yes, there's been several remarks that have been made so far that I'd like to pick up on and maybe expand a little bit. Well, I think the critical issue for me in terms of thinking about this transition points or transformations is that we recognize the importance of moving towards a nexus perspective, as IPBES is really doing very well, exceptionally well with its current scoping study around a new plan nexus assessment. And it's the way we have to go, because a lot of these solutions are going to probably be at the interfaces between sectors, between management strategies and other things that can fall between the cracks if we don't take a more holistic perspective on socio-ecological systems in terms of how we understand them and how we might manage. So specifically, if I look at my own interests, I'm really interested in the land system. You know, we know that humans use up to about 3/4 of the ice-free terrestrial surface, and that obviously has enormous impacts on both terrestrial biodiversity, but also freshwater biodiversity in terms of rivers and wetlands. But the point is, and within that, we also have almost 40% of the surface of the Earth, which is used for agriculture, mostly for food production. So that gives us enormous scope to manage the food systems better in ways that can have multiple benefits in terms of livelihoods and providing food for a growing population, but also biodiversity benefits at the same time. And I think, as David's already started mentioning, you know, we know that there are multiple interventions on the supply side to improve sustainable production of food production. And I'm not going to go through a very long list, but we know there are many, many livestock, grassland, cropland, etc., soil management strategies that we can implement. And people are talking also about managing the demand side. And again, we know that the need for sustainable consumption, primarily dietary considerations, the amount of meat we're consuming, or certain societies around the world, are things that we can really reflect on dealing. But also we need to think about value chains as well. So the connection between the supply and demand, the storage and distribution of food has many sort of societal and access issues around that, but it also basically can lead to waste if done badly. So a waste of food is also a waste of land. This is land that we can no longer use for the conservation of biodiversity or for the production of food. So we know we've got these multiple things. I would say in terms of this more holistic nexus perspective, there are so many things we can do that even with marginal gains across a multitude of different interventions can lead to transformative situations. And sometimes we probably think about transformation as being some major systemic change, but actually there are lots and lots of things we can do today that we could just do better, things that are known, current technologies, different ways of implementation, things done better, embedding biodiversity policy across different sectoral policy domains would be absolutely critical in trying to support these types of activities. So I think the transformation is critical, that we think about some of these marginal gains. Things like, if you look on the supply side, why are we using and increasingly using large areas of land for large-scale industrialized bioenergy production, when we could be using that land for food production or using that land for nature conservation? So these types of issues that we need to reflect about. On the demand side, clearly dietary change is critical. Since the mid-1970s, the proportion of the world's population who are either overweight or obese has approximately doubled. That also is a major waste of food. You know, we can either throw food away in the bin or we can wear it around our middles. You know, it's still a waste. And it's, again, associated with a waste of land and a waste of opportunities for the conservation of biodiversity. And of course, it has win-win benefits as well. There are multiple health benefits of more appropriate and sustainable diets. So we need to reflect on how we might do that. I'll maybe come back a little bit later with a few ideas about that. But I'll leave it at that moment, Cordelia. Thanks.
And yes, exactly. I wanted to ask Lynn or Rashid to actually jump in, talking about the marine environment, knowing that a lot of people actually rely on the oceans for food.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. We rely on the ocean for food, for lots of things, for moderating the climate. The ocean is 70% of the Earth's surface. So we cannot afford to mess up the ocean, because if you mess up 70% of what is important to you, then you are in trouble. You know, I tell my students, if you keep scoring 30%, you never go anywhere. So the ocean is fundamental here. Now, the first point I want to make with regards to this question of transformation is that I think in general, we need to really think at a higher level, in this sense, that whatever policies or programs or projects or actions we take, they should be such that they lead to positive feedback from people to biodiversity to nature, and from nature to people. At the moment, a lot of our actions are actually leading to negative feedbacks. And I'll give you examples. For example, the way we use subsidies in fisheries, right? We give subsidies to companies to go and just deplete the resources. This is a clear example of negative feedback. So we take the fish down, we get less food, people hang on the last fish, you just keep going down the hill. This has to stop. And that is at a high level. Now, to make this more concrete, I will talk about financing, about how to fund biodiversity, and how we invest in biodiversity-based economic activities, which means all human activities, actually. There is no economic activity that you cannot take down to biodiversity in the beginning. I like to say that from biodiversity, all the good things come. We get the fish, we have the oil, we have the land to do agriculture, and to biodiversity, all the bad things human beings generate go. The pollution, right? Whether it's plastic, whether it's CO2 we pump. And we have to organize this cleverly, otherwise we're going to take ourselves down. So financing is crucial, because no matter how good your intentions or your plans are, they die at the graveyard of no finance. So we have to find a way to raise the resources we need to really keep our biodiversity going. And there are various ways you can do this. At the moment, we already have a lot of public finance and private finance, insurance money going into biodiversity, but a lot of them are negative. They lead to degradation, right? For example, the OECD says we give about $500 billion a year to activities that degrade biodiversity. $500 billion. There you go. So how about we find a way to divert this, to make them do good for people and nature rather than destroy nature? So that's the point. In fisheries, we give about 35 billion. And our own work shows that 22 billion of these actually are what we call harmful capacity enhancing subsidies that lead to overfishing. How about you redirect this? I'm not saying take the money out of the communities. In fact, we should take more money there, but let the money work for nature and people rather than destroy them, right? So no fuel subsidies, use the money to help people to retrain, get education, put healthcare in the villages rather than use the money to destroy the resource they depend on. So that is it. My postdoc, Dana Miller, found out that a lot of insurance companies funding illegal fishing, which is crazy. They give insurance to boats that do illegal fishing. That is not a good way to use insurance. We should rather use it. So the way we think of funding, financing, and investment is crucial in actually dealing with this, both the economics, the biodiversity, and the social also. For example, in our subsidies estimate, 80% of all the subsidies we give to the fishing sector goes to large-scale industrial fishing boats. Just think about that. So we disadvantage the small community boats and the people who work in them. A lot of women work in small-scale fisheries and in large-scale. So you are aggravating gender issues, right? You are making it more difficult for women to participate, more youth to participate. So it's this kind of thinking we really need to do to get real transformation. And I will stop here and we can get back. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Yes, please.
Thanks, Rashid. So I was just wanting to pick up a little bit on what Shadia and Mark had said, and now Rashid, you've also said, and that's really influencing human use of biodiversity, of nature. And something that's really been bothering me in the past few months is the use of small pelagic fish, for example. Instead of it going to human consumption, and we know that the per capita consumption of fish has more than doubled since about the 1960s. And this is because we have aquaculture, largely, because our catches have kind of stabilized now. But instead of directing small pelagic fish to human consumption and influencing the markets thereof, we're putting them straight into fish meal. And then they're going off to, poultry farmers and aquaculture feeds and things. And there really are sustainable alternatives. And it's something we've been looking into. You can use things like fly larvae, which feed on waste, food waste, and generate animal feed from that, which is really a good source of protein. And there's a lot of work that's been going on to that. But it's that kind of thinking that I've been grappling with lately, and it's just it's really getting to how can we try to keep our ecosystems integral? How can we keep ecosystems integrity and allow the ecosystems to function, but still use them maximally, so that we take what we need, we benefit the humans in terms of food, but also the jobs and the economics, as Rashid was saying. So it all kind of comes down to the ecosystem approach and really just looking at things more holistically. But it starts with influencing the consumers and making them aware of, okay, should we really be asking them difficult questions? Should we be supporting an aquaculture industry that is taking out our small pelagic fish, which are a lot of our vulnerable predators, including fish that we eat as table fish, but also our vulnerable predators that are part of ecosystem functioning, our marine mammals, our seabirds? Should we be taking that and using it? You know, it's getting people thinking, I think, and making them more aware of the fact that they do have choices, and they can really contribute to ensuring that our ecosystems function, that our biodiversity is sustained, and that we make better use of nature. So I think that's just kind of things that have been in my head, and then with the three panelists chatting now, I just wanted to raise that for now, but I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. And I think looking at Mark, he looks like he wants to respond to this. No? No. Okay, so maybe I think what Lynn said actually takes me also to a discussion that's actually coming up in a question and answer from the audience. Is this like thinking about incremental changes, small changes? What can we actually do on a local scale? What are the actors that we need to involve? So maybe I can invite you to think illustrate this a little bit more. Who would like? Mark, yes, please.
Yeah, I think there was a comment from Gary in the chat, actually, which talks about the point about what we can do now if we do it better can actually have a major impact. And in many cases, to decision makers, it's, I think the term Gary used was less intimidating. And I think that's right. I was actually involved in a study, it was a few years ago now, where we interviewed decision makers on their attitudes towards transformative change. And the reality is, yeah, they're slightly intimidated by that because, and it's logical, because if you have something which appears to be a systemic wholesale change, you have no evidence to prove it's going to be any better than where you are today. And there's risks associated with that. And you may get lock-in, you may not come back again. Now, that doesn't mean that we still, in many cases, do need systemic change. And I think it's absolutely appropriate to have that on the agenda and reflect on it. But let's not lose sight of the fact that incremental changes, if done better, and if done across a broad range of potential interventions, can actually have very significant effects. And there is an emerging literature that shows this as well. So maybe we need this sort of dual thinking around, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, sorry to use an expression, but let's just do what we know we can do today better. And that's more likely to be acceptable in decision-making circles. But at the same time, in parallel, let's reflect on some of the more major systemic changes that may actually be necessary to get us to the objectives in terms of biodiversity.
Yeah, so Mark, I like that. I like your ending very much. I mean, it's a duality doing things because you need those incremental changes, definitely. But at the same time, you need some big thinking because some of these problems, little marginal changes will not do it. So the combination is really the power here. And I like that. Thinking about fisheries, for example, of course, we need to improve management. We need to take out subsidies. We need to do all the things we know how to do better, right? But at the same time, I think it's okay to ask the question, do we actually need to fish the high seas? Do we need to fish in the high seas? Does it make sense economically, biologically, socially? And some of the emerging literature is, no, it doesn't make sense, actually. We are better off shutting the damn thing off. And so once you are improving, we have to have this big thinking, and then maybe we can get the world to move. Actually, the first time me and others started talking about this, people thought we are crazy. But we have started shutting down the high seas. The Ross Sea was closed down. And I myself was surprised that the world was able to do this. So duality, I love that. We have to do the two together. Yeah, thanks for that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Chadia, please.
Yeah, just a quick remark about what Mark said about land use change. I think until now, we see that health or human considerations of land use change projects are not really incorporated adequately. And we need to change this. Because when you have a development project or you are doing some work in the forest or agriculture, you have to think how this will impact on human health and do a risk assessment and impact assessment, and then take your decision based on the evidence. I think we are missing this major change that need to happen. So we are not repeating the cycle again of outbreaks and deforestation and so on.
Great. Thank you, Chadia. Lynn, did you want to respond?
I was just wanting to pick up something that was in the chat, and it kind of relates to what Rashid was also saying, and that's just that should we be doing, so somebody asked in the chat a really interesting question, what should we be doing at the global level? And should we be doing things at the local level to solve the biodiversity issues, but will what we do at the local level kind of undermine what we're doing globally? Will they, and my answer to that was that they're going to be trade-offs, and I think it links in a lot with what we've been saying all along. There are always going to be trade-offs in terms of what we're prioritizing in terms of the nature's contributions to people, ecosystem services. They're going to be trade-offs. It depends on what we prioritize. But at the local scale, we can identify some of what for our region is priority, and hopefully by addressing one or a few of those at the same time will strengthen our actions and our efforts at actually addressing biodiversity in general. I'm not sure if I'm making myself so clear, but really what I wanted to just highlight is that there will always be trade-offs. And that's because everything is so interlinked. So all of nature's contributions to people, all of our ecosystem services, all of our drivers are interlinked in a huge big web. I work on food web, so it's a bit like that for me. Everything is kind of interlinked. But if we can pick out some of the key things and the key processes and influence those, then we can really make a change. And so globally, I think we need these big initiatives. We need CBD, we need IPBES, we need IPCC. It's something else I'd like to come to. But in terms of actually making those little differences, we need to rely on what the local, regional and national governments are going to be able to do for that. And then just, do things piecemeal, I guess. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I see Chadia nodding. Yes.
Thank you. Just to second what Lynn said, that we need both the local action and the global action as well. But one untapped issue here is the use of citizen science for biodiversity research and understanding what works really at the country or local level. We have now a lot of volunteers and community organizations participating in biodiversity projects and doing excellent work, but majority of this work and data collected through it doesn't reach the peer review journals. So we are missing this huge data set to understand better what works at the community level. We need to find a way to bring this local knowledge and the indigenous knowledge into the global conversation better.
Can I follow up? Yeah, so this is great. I mean, we have a project now, and this was actually encouraged by the Research Council of Canada. They call them partnership projects, and they are amazing. Actually, they allow you up to 7 years to put together a team of academics, non-academics, government people, practitioners, indigenous people, to form groups to look at issues that are interdisciplinary, cut across the boundaries, get different perspectives. And we have one called Ocean Canada, the Ocean Canada Partnership. You can check the website. It's actually amazing. And in there, what we do, in addition to the research, first we co-create. You work with indigenous people in BC. You cannot just do it alone. And together we we find the issues and work together. And the products are quite amazing. We also have a movie making professor on the team, right? So they don't only report what we find, they document how the process is done, you know. And this has been amazing to see how modern, I call this modern science, where you really get, and then you have this partners just take off the results and actually apply them and use them, whether it's the government, Department of Fisheries or Oceans, or First Nations people, or NGOs. It's quite, so I think that is the kind of ways we can structure at least some of our research in order to do action-based, community-based research that is useful.
Okay, thanks very much, Rashid. Looking at the audience questions, I wondered, Lynn, whether you want to come back to the IPCC, the link you mentioned.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Cornelia. So what I was thinking about there was just to highlight the importance of the biodiversity community linking really strongly with the climate community. So, for example, I'm thinking of IPBES and IPCC and CBD, kind of, because if we look at all of our different kind of our specific goals in terms of biodiversity, they're all influenced by climate. Climate's an kind of overarching influence. If we can mitigate for a lot of those climate effects, we end up making it a lot easier to address many of our biodiversity targets. And so I was just going to encourage, and it has already begun, but perhaps not so much at the regional and local level, more kind of globally and kind of academically perhaps, but we need to really encourage actions that address climate, and then how will that influence our biodiversity benefits. That's really just what I wanted to raise there, and see if there was any discussion on that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that, Lynn, you know, that is really good. Looking at how climate action can help, but also how the actions we take on biodiversity can help climate change. We're doing work where we say that stopping or reducing overfishing is climate action, right? If we don't empty the ocean, the animals will be there to sequester some of the carbon. They will be there to do lots of things to mitigate climate. So you can also look from the other direction, right? So, and it's just kind of comprehensive, more integrated thinking, like almost everybody says here, that will help us. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. There's actually two other questions from the audience that I'd like to ask you. The one that I've just seen is, do we actually need to define a set of global biodiversity indexes that can be used as a standard? Do we need this, or is there one that is actually best? So, and how reliable are those actually? So what are your thoughts on that? I think Lynn, Mark, Lynn, yes, and then Mark.
Sorry, I haven't been looking in the chat at the moment, but I think what you were saying is, should we have like one target, like we do with, you know,
with the climate, yeah.
Yeah. And I think the general thinking from the various groups that have been addressing these and grappling with these issues is that no, biodiversity is so multifaceted that we really need to have a set, a whole suite of goals, of goals or objectives, whatever you like to call them, and then by addressing each of those, we kind of reinforce what we're trying to do in the others. But each of those will be looking after a different facet of our biodiversity. So if you think about genetics, within genetics, there's a whole lot of different facets. If you think about, well, my kind of pet thing, ecosystem integrity, within that, there's kind of your spatial integrity, your structure integrity, your species composition, your ecosystem functioning. And so you need to kind of, if you lose one of those, you are diminishing your possibility of success at the whole thing, ecosystem integrity, for example. And it's the same thing if you span that up to the bigger picture. So yeah, so I think basically a set of goals that are going to be building on one another and that are addressing the different facets, but then kind of coming together. Yeah, that would be, I think, my summary of what what people have been discussing in the last kind of year or two at various different fora.
Okay, thank you. Mark? Yes.
Yeah, if I might respectfully disagree, being a panel, we have to have some disagreement.
Yes.
I think the first question is, who is the audience for whatever indicators you want to produce? So from a scientific perspective, a wide range of indicators that cover a wide range of the facets of biodiversity is really critical, because we need to understand there's not a single indicator that can really reflect or represent the science and understanding of what biodiversity is all about, because you have everything from genetic diversity through species diversity, etc. Many different indicators. But I think that changes if you think of things at a political level. And if you think about policymakers and decision makers, then you have a different purpose for those indicators. It's no longer about communicating the science per se or understanding of the science. It's about communicating at probably a fairly simple level that would facilitate the development of policy that would galvanize policy around protecting biodiversity. And thanks for the introduction, Cornelia, but so I've recently published a paper on this topic, which maybe will circulate later. I'm not going to do a plug now. And it was really just trying to address this issue. And interestingly, the reason I ended up working with colleagues in producing this paper was it was an explicit request, I'm not going to name them, but from a large supranational political organization who said, we need something for biodiversity that's just like the 2-degree global mean temperature target for climate change. And they said, and the purpose of this is not about science, it's actually about trying to communicate to policy communities something that they can aim for, that gives them an idea, as has, in principle at least, although we could debate this as well in terms of its effectiveness, as has been the case for the climate change community. So I think it does come back to the audience, and I think there is a space for individual targets. We actually came up with targets based around extinctions and extinction risk, because we felt that is clearly understandable and embodies the fundamental loss of genetic diversity within biodiversity. So that was our issue. I'll send you the paper, then you can have a little read.
Yeah. Okay, great. Shadia, yes.
I was just going to say, and I'll send you our paper.
Okay.
Yes, paper.
Yes, exactly. But Shadia wanted to respond, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are also another group of scientists looking at the same to have goals for each of the planetary supporting systems for us. And this is the Earth Commission. I think Cornelia knows well about them, and I can share the link here. So they are trying to find, like you said, the goal for the climate change is 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5. And then we are trying to find another or similar mechanism to find one for the ocean, one for biodiversity, one for land, and one for water, because those are the 4 main systems that can support us to live in this planet in harmony with our nature and the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so in the Q&A, I see somebody asking about the role of the market. I mean, whether,
yes.
Yeah, all those, I don't know, the thing has gone up, but essentially, whether markets can help, and the answer is obviously yes. I think the markets have a big role. We know that people respond to prices like crazy. I mean, we all love, excuse me to say this, including myself, we all love cheap things, right? We all valuable things. I mean, we want value for money. I think that's better than saying cheap things, so we all like that. And so the market is important. The only addition to that is that the market alone obviously cannot do it. So we need an enabling environment. We need a societal level influences, because, hey, markets always go for what is mostly traded on the market, right? And we know there's a lot of valuable stuff that are not. So yes, there is a big role for the market.
Okay. Right. Thank you so much, Rashid. We slowly coming to the end of the session. There's one question I would like to ask you as well, or all of you. that's come up in the chat was actually the question I was sent in earlier. What would be, in order to fix our relationship with nature, should we actually change the narrative, thinking of, or do we need to strengthen the narrative that humans are actually part of nature? Because I think a lot of the problems that we're looking at, they're stemming from because we're seeing ourselves apart from it. So can I get some responses from you on that to close? Yes, Lynn, please.
Sorry, I have a lot to say. I think just I can use the field that I work in and that Rashid works in, and that's the whole the ecosystem approach to fishing, and in that very clearly, the human dimension is seen as integral. It's one of the key cornerstones. So we have ecological well-being, if you want to put it like that, so the ecology, and then you have the human well-being, which is, do we have enough employment? What's the economy looking like? What are people's values being attended to? And that's not just in terms of monetary things. That's people's learning, people's cultures, people's connections with nature, and so the whole ecosystem approach to fisheries, or ecosystem-based management, if you're making it broader than that and extending it into other fields beyond fisheries, is really recognizing that humans are part of it, and humans need to rely on nature to survive and to thrive in particular. And so we are part of the ecosystem, and I think if we see ourselves as outside, we miss the whole link of it. It's a it's not just a one-way thing. It's this continual feedback, and so I definitely think, speaking just from the marine side, we very much recognize that. I'm not an expert in terrestrial, at all. So
yeah. So can I?
Yes, and then Chatya, yes.
Yeah, so Link, that's good. I mean, I'm a believer in ecosystem-based management, obviously. My only caveat there is that when we say that people and nature we should see them together, we need to really have in mind that we are the ones who can take action. We are the thinkers. We can take responsibility. We need to take responsibility, right? And so that's the other part. So in that sense, we are not exactly like whales, for example, right? So that has to be in focus. Otherwise, we'll mess up things even more, I think.
Okay.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you, Rashid. Shadia.
Thank you. The biodiversity new framework, the vision is to have to live in harmony with nature. This is what we want to achieve by 2050, and we have milestones up until then to live with it. And also from the health perspective, as I am public health professionals, and given that we are now in the pandemic phase, also we are working towards building forward with nature. It's not building back better, it's building forward with nature, because this pandemic have taught us the value of nature for us. And just to be outside and see the trees and walk in the park, and how much this is important for our mental health and for our physical health. And appreciating this, the thinking now is how we can preserve it, how we can conserve our nature so it can support us in return, and we can live on this planet in equitable and fair manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Chadia. Mark, would you like to add something to this?
Thanks, Cordelia. Maybe just a couple of quick points. I think it's interesting that the biodiversity crisis seems to be sometimes a little secondary to the climate change crisis, I think particularly in decision makers' minds, and maybe in the public as well. And I always find that a bit strange, because there's plenty of TV programs, films, other media that are used to communicate the sadness of biodiversity loss, and yet it still doesn't necessarily connect with the public. I mean, part of the reason, the explanation for that might be that climate change as a crisis is more mature, it's been going longer. The IPCC has been around a lot longer than IPBES, and I think IPBES is catching up quickly, doing a great job, and maybe it just needs a bit more time. But I think there's critically such an important need to better communicate all of the types of issues that we're talking about with people. And how you do that is enormously challenging, but maybe we need to give some more reflection on that. I mean, there's sort of, you know, there's certain actions you can take in terms of awareness raising. There are things you can do like labeling of food, and, you know, you've just killed an orangutan by consuming this good or something. Oh, there are things, yeah, I exaggerate obviously, but there are things you could do to communicate and raise awareness in the eyes of the public. But ultimately, I think we have to recognize that having public perception of the problem is part of the solution, but the public will not have perfect knowledge about the consequences of their consumption actions, however well we try to communicate that. And that, for me, means that there's always going to be the need for decision makers, probably public, but also private sector decision makers, to intervene at some point in order for us to maintain the resources that we all rely upon. And I think that's ultimately quite critical.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Shadia, final point. I think we're nearing the end of the session, unfortunately.
Thank you. I will just add to what Mark said about understanding the risk behavior and how we are dealing with nature and how we are exploiting the natural resources. I think this understanding of the impact on us is not clear for everybody. Not just the public, but also in disciplines or sectors not dealing directly with biodiversity or ecological or environmental factors. And this is one of the issues that we have to, why we advocate for the One Health approach. So we can bring those sectors together and those disciplines, and they can understand each other when we talk about the impact and the risk drivers and what can be done about them. And the other important aspect is the economic analysis of the return on investment. If I preserve the nature or I conserve this land, what kind of economic investment will I get? Is it worth it to do it? Of course, it's worth it, because now we have produced more economic analysis, for example, for the pandemics. Until now, we have lost trillions of dollars in jobs and livelihood, but also in the response itself. While fraction of this could have been used for prevention and preparedness, and we could have saved ourselves this whole chaos that we are in now, and with economic benefit.
Yes.
Cornelia, I know you are running for time. Yeah. This economic analysis is important, and some of us have been doing this, but I think one of the main blocks is, even when you do this analysis, they ask you how long do I have to wait for this? So we have the short-term dimension to this, which is a block, and we have to find a way to deal with this. Otherwise, we don't move. So yeah, that's just a quick addition. Thanks.
Thank you. Lynn, do you have anything that you'd like to leave as a final message? And then I also like to invite Anne and David to maybe make a short closing statement.
Yes, I was just starting to type it. I was just going to agree with one of the attendants who was put something into the chat, and that is that I think we do all have a role to play, and we do have, and it is necessary to disseminate our work and to make people aware, and just so that everybody has a role in it. I mean, everybody needs to be able to buy in to a certain degree, and different degrees depending on you know, where they are, what role they're playing in society. But I think if everybody is made aware of the issues, at least some of the issues are going to be sitting with different people, and they will be drawn and encouraged to do something about them. So I think I just wanted to say that I think we all have a really important role to play, and that by putting ourselves out there and raising the issues and identifying priorities for people to think about, we're just getting more of an active population. And I think that's really our only hope.
Thank you, Lynn. David, on maybe some final remarks. David.
Yes, should I go, or Andrew?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I think there's been a very rich discussion, and maybe I just sort of echo and pick up on a few key points that I've heard. And starting, I think, with saying, I think, we are part of nature, and we need to examine how the relationship between humans and the rest of nature can improve, and that the One Health idea, which is given a boost, I think, because of the situation we find ourselves in with the pandemic. It will be really important as we look at how to manage our interaction with wildlife, how we manage our landscapes, to do that in a way that recognizes all of the linkages between biodiversity and health, and not just the impact of disease emergence from wildlife. And in fact, if you look at the GBO5, you'll see that we call for a biodiversity inclusive One Health approach that recognizes the multi-dimensions of health and all of these linkages. The links with climate change, I think certainly most of the drivers of biodiversity loss and climate change, well, they have a huge overlap, right? There's a lot of drivers in common. And in fact, they're also common with many of the drivers that have increased the risk of pandemics. So we certainly should be looking at these things together. And I actually think the public is ahead of us on this, or ahead of the structures in terms of having different conventions and different assessment bodies. I think most people out there on the streets and they recognize this as there is something wrong in the way we're managing in the planet, and that includes the climate issue and the biodiversity issue. Thirdly, people have been making the links with SDGs, and yes, there are many trade-offs and so on, and Lynn has talked about some of these trade-offs, but there are also many opportunities and synergies. Some of the SDGs that argue for gender equality, for reducing inequalities more generally, for investing in education and so on, are essential. And in fact, without them, we will not achieve any of the things that we're talking about, whether this is about biodiversity, climate, or health. Certainly, I would support what Rashid and others were saying about a twin track approach, that we look at building on what we know that works at the same time as looking for the steps that need to be taken to make transformative changes happen. And how can we link these two so that the building on the incremental can prepare the way for the transformative, rather than lock us into bad or maladaptive pathways. And in doing that, then we think about, what sort of post-2020 framework we need. And there's been comments in the chat, which I think are very important points. If we just repeat what we did last time, we're not going to get better results. This isn't just about setting targets, however good those targets are, and certainly we need pretty ambitious targets. But unless we have a step change in the political attention given to this issue, alongside climate change, alongside health, we're not going to get the changes we need. And unless we are able to see beyond our silos, to connect work in different sectors, we're not going to get the changes we want. So I think we all still have to think a lot. How can we develop a post-2020 framework that isn't, and we've said this in the negotiations, because often people are saying, okay, should it be ambitious or should it be realistic? We know that the changes that are needed to move to sustainability are huge. They're not going to be easy. So what is it that we can put in a post-2020 framework that will make it easier, facilitate, right? That's what facilitate means. Make it easier to have these difficult things happen. Rashid's talked about subsidies. That's certainly one of them. But there's a number of things that we need to think about in that respect. And then finally, we definitely need to be able to improve our monitoring. Gary Geller made an important point in one of the questions there. We have to get serious. At the moment in the biodiversity world, most of the time we're begging and borrowing for monitoring efforts, for indicators. We need governments to invest seriously in monitoring. I think we'll need multiple indicators, even if we have simpler goals for communication purposes. Anyway, thank you for the discussion, and I encourage you all to continue the good work and to continue to help us and to help the countries as they negotiate the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, so many things to say, of course. I have to start with the last comment that David made. It's been also a big topic, a pet topic of mine, by really trying to push this global biodiversity observing system, which the world does not have and badly needs. And we've been limping, as David mentioned, borrowing from the research community, in particular from, there is no operational funding, very little. There is nothing that is fully organized. We need something like the meteorological services for biodiversity. We need a WMO for biodiversity. Right now we have GeoBond, which is doing its best, but it really needs to be brought to the next level with really massive investment. And that should really be one of the outcomes of COP15, because as long as we don't have that major instrument, we will not be able to have the types of measurements that we need. On climate and biodiversity, I wanted to flag that modestly, IPBES and IPCC have really started to show the way by working together. Of course, it's just early days. But there was a workshop in December. The report will come out in April on synergies and trade-offs between biodiversity and climate change. And the idea, of course, is to pave the way for more, perhaps one day a common assessment between IPBES and IPCC. And we are really working together now to really imagine that future together. Overall, as a community, we should not feel discouraged that we are still a bit lower on the radar compared to climate change. I think that we are quickly catching up. We should not have climate envy. We have already, I think, changed the conversation on biodiversity. And so that's our collective goal for 2021. It's our year. And this year we are really going to not only talk about biodiversity at COP15, but also I think for the first time at COP26 of the Climate Change Convention. That's really very important. The UK hosting is determined to do that and to really place an emphasis on those important linkages between biodiversity and climate change. The pandemic in the early stages was threatening a little bit the really major visibility that the world wanted to have on biodiversity. I think that now we've seen that it's not happening. In fact, it's the opposite. It's giving an opportunity to emphasize the importance of biodiversity as a way to control pandemics. So that's providing an added value to that. And then perhaps lastly, as an IPBES perspective, we'll continue to try and accompany this conversation. The two next things on the radar for IPBES are a transformative change assessment, which we're currently scoping, brushing the contours of, and a nexus assessment to look at the links between food, water, health, biodiversity, and climate change. So that's coming up on the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. And with that, I would actually very much like to thank you all for participating in the session, for the very rich discussions we had within the panel, but also going on in the chat with the audience. So thank you very much, everyone.